A Curious Skull from Northeast Michigan by Dennis M. Morrison, and that's me. A number of years ago, I and my stepson David found a very unique skull, whose upper portion was embedded in a very grainy but hard rock. The rock also seemed to have an oily smell to it, and we made this find near Oscoda, Michigan. However, being that there's still a lot of bone exfoliating out from the rock, I'm hesitant to give an exact location, because even though I live in Saginaw right now, someday I'd like to get back up there and do a little more exploring about it. But let me tell you first about our find, and then the various theories that have been given to me as to what type of animal the skull may have been from, and how old it actually, might be. The rock outcropping that this was found in, I am told, is one of the oldest outcroppings to be found in Michigan. It is a semi-wooded area, and the day David and I decided to visit the outcropping, there were hundreds of bone fragments, varying greatly in size, that were just laying about. And these fragments were bleached pure white. None were fossilized, and I like to call them pre-fossils, as they were, in the process of becoming fossils. Anyways, we took a lot of photos and then began to gather a few pieces to study at home later. This layer of rock has an underlayer of sand, and I noticed teeth in the rock just where the sand and rock layer came together, where it met. We got down for a closer look and began moving sand away with our hands, and as we did, a very large jawbone was uncovered, as well as part of the upper skull, which was firmly held by the rock layer, which seemed to have formed actually around the skull. We tried to carefully remove the skull, which was quite difficult to dislodge from the rock, and being as the stone was quite granular, after several hours of work, the jaw and skull finally lay before us, freed from the rock that had encased it for so many years. At this point, David returned to the car to fetch a box with some baggies and some much-needed cold sodas, as it was beastly hot that day, and I'm fairly adept at finding fossils, but I truly had no idea as to what sort of animal this skull represented. Nonetheless, I was determined to find out what the animal was, and approximately how old it would date to. I had communicated over the years with two fossil experts via the internet. Via the internet. I just dropped my cat. That's why I said whoops, I'm sorry. Anyways, I emailed them detailed photos of the site, the rock, and the skull. When they replied, I was quite surprised, and separately they both came to the same conclusion. These educated guesses were that the skull belonged to a camel. A camel in Michigan? Well, some people believe in ancient times camel and other exotic beasts indeed walked what would one day be Michigan. Both also estimated that the age would be about 12,000 years old, based primarily on the rock which had formed around it. Now, you might ask if there were animals walking about here 12,000 and more years ago, and the answer would be, yeah, there were. I'm reminded of an incident concerning my great friend and mentor, Jerry Wagner, and myself. We went to visit a site on Old US 23 about 8 miles from where I made my find, and this was at the home of John Henry. Now, Mr. Henry had been excavating a pond by his house when he unearthed some very large animal remains. He told Jerry and myself that the state had identified the teeth, which were enormous, bones, and tusks as being that of a Jefferson mammoth, a relative to the woolly mammoth, and was just as woolly. The enormous beast would have been older than 12,000 years. I don't recall if the state ever radiocarbon dated it or not, though. And while this is a bit off track, I must tell you of a find Jerry made right there in that dirt piled up from the pond excavations, which was a really significant find. He found, for what all intents and purposes looked like a skinning stone. It was a dark greenish color stone, wedge-shaped, and coming down to a bit on one end. It was about 6 inches long and 3.5 inches across, and probably about a half an inch thick, maybe not quite that much thick. What is so amazing about this find is that it was associated with the Jefferson Mammoth, and if it was a skinning stone made by man, that would place man in northeast Michigan much further back than was previously thought. So you can see Jerry's find was truly amazing, but the information fell through the cracks because it was never reported to the state archaeologist, who at the time I believe was John Halsey. But back to the topic at hand. The Jefferson Mammoth proves that there were indeed animals in Michigan which have not been found here in the wild for thousands of years, and that, to me, adds credibility that the skull David and I found could actually be 12,000 years old. The skull we found measured about 15 inches long by about 10 to 11 inches across. The teeth were about the size of, say, an adult horse's teeth. All the teeth were present when our find was made. There are a few other very ancient sites found in the general area, and when I say ancient, I mean that the site predates the woodland period Indians. For example, on F-41 going out towards the former Wordsmith Air Force Base is a site known as the Branch Burial Site on the high banks of Annetton Creek. Now, the burials here were red ochre burials, and also found was one cremation and a skull cap. The state of Michigan conducted limited excavations at this site and deduced that the skeletal remains went back to the late Archaic period, which means they could have been 6,000 plus years old. The middle and late woodland sites my first wife Kathy and I excavated in the Oscoda area dated back at the most 2,000 to 3,000 years, but this was long after the passing of the megafauna, as they are called, the Jefferson mammoth, the woolly mammoth, giant ground sloth, and possibly camel. The picture that I have here is the only one remaining in my collection, and if based on looking at the photo you would like to make a comment on it, please feel free to leave your comment below. I'm always interested in hearing what my viewers and subscribers have to say. So that's it about the curious skull from the northeast Michigan, Oscoda area, possibly a camel skull, which could be as much as 12,000 plus years old. Thanks for taking a watch.